Today we're going to be looking at the scientific method for sociology. You have a fillable PDF of guided notes to accompany this presentation, and as you watch the presentation, please complete your fillable PDF. Of course, if you should need to, you certainly may rewind and rewatch some material. In other cases, you can simply just pause and come back to it later. And especially with our introductory video, if you've seen it before or feel that it's not necessary to you, you may skip it and move ahead in the presentation. All right, with that, let's get started. Right. We will start off with that introductory video I mentioned in the previous slide. If you have seen this before, again, you are welcome to bypass it and continue.
What puts the science in social science? The things you probably think of as science, like biology or physics or chemistry, can seem a world apart from sociology and the concepts we've introduced so far. But sociology is a type of science. It's just not one that uses beakers or microscopes. Rather than investigating the physical, natural world, sociology explores the social world. Now, there are different schools of thought within sociology about the best way to understand the social world, but one of the primary means of conducting sociology uses many of the same basic principles and methods as any of your hard clinical sciences. Can sociology use the scientific method? Check. Does it rely on empirical data? Check. And graphs? Heck yeah! A science is really any practice that uses a systematic method of observation to gain knowledge. And you probably know that systematic method as the scientific method. Basically, you come up with some question about the world and then develop a testable theory about how you could answer that question. And you develop and test your theory by gathering empirical evidence, that is, verifiable information that's collected in a systematic way. Now, whether you're using it to explore the natural world or the social world, the scientific method is rooted in the philosophy known as positivism. First laid out by Auguste Comte, yes, the same Auguste Comte that we introduced as the founder of sociology a couple episodes ago, positivism argues that phenomena can be studied through direct observation, and that these observations can be pulled together into theories or facts that can help us understand how the world works. Now, you might be wondering where the positive and positivist comes into play. Was Comte just a glass half full kind of guy? Well, positive in this case doesn't refer to optimism, and it doesn't mean I'm positive that I'm right. Instead, a positive theory is one that's objective and fact-based, whereas a normative theory is subjective and value-based. Which brings us to the first of our three types of sociological inquiry: positivist sociology, or the study of society based on systematic observations of social behavior. And here, objective is the key word. As scientific researchers, sociologists must set aside their own values and beliefs to approach their work as neutral observers and use empirical evidence to answer questions about how the social world works. So, what kind of evidence are you looking for? If you're doing quantitative research, you want data. Quantitative research is the study of observable relationships in the world using mathematical or statistical methods. Basically, quantitative evidence is information that you can count or tally up. But this doesn't just mean number-based data like income or age. You can also use it to categorize people or things, like the state you live in, your gender, or your race. And quantitative evidence can be used in lots of different ways. For example, there's descriptive data, which does just what it sounds like. It describes facts relevant to the question you're researching. Like, maybe you want to know how income is distributed across households in the United States. Quantitative data are your friend here. This graph is the distribution of household incomes in 2014 produced by the US Census Bureau. The height of the bars in the graph indicate the number of households at a certain income level, and the point labeled 50th is an important one because it's the median income, the absolute middle observation in the sample. That means that 50% of households have lower incomes than that level and 50% have higher incomes. In this case, the median income is $53,700. But be careful about the conclusions you draw from this graph. The median may be the observation in the middle, but it's not the same as the average household income. That distinction goes to the mean, which is the sum of all the values divided by the number of observations. So in 2014, the mean household income was $75,700. That's a lot higher than the median. What's up with that? Why is there a gap between the mean and the median? Well, think back to the group that the Occupy Wall Street movement was concerned with, the 1%. That political label is actually a descriptive statistic. It describes the percent of the population with the highest income. And the fact that the income of that 1% is so much higher than the incomes of the other 99%, that's why we have a gap between the mean and the median. And I'm not being political here. It's pure mathematics. If you have 99 people making $50,000 per year and one person making $50 million per year, what's going to happen to the mean income? it's going to be pulled way up by the one very rich person. Even though the mode, or the most common observation in your sample, is the same as the median income, $50,000, the mean will be over $500,000. Another type of evidence that sociologists use is qualitative data, or information that's not in numerical form. Where quantitative data try to measure, qualitative data try to illustrate or characterize. Sometimes the information that you need can't or shouldn't be distilled into a number in a spreadsheet. Instead, you use descriptions of the world gathered through interviews, questionnaires, and first-hand observation. Like, why do some people get married and some people commit to long-term partnerships without getting married? Maybe some of that is quantifiable, but a lot of the process behind making a decision like that is going to come down to how the couple feels about marriage. And that can't be easily stated in a statistic. There are, of course, limitations to sociology as a positivist discipline. Not everything you want to know about society is going to fit into observable, measurable categories. And what's worse, I don't know if you've noticed this, but human beings are pretty unpredictable. In much of the natural sciences, the environment in which research is done is completely controlled by scientists. Like microbes in a petri dish, they're probably not going to develop free will and mess around with your carefully designed experiment. But if you're studying human behavior, you can't control the environment or how your subject interacts with that environment. So if you're interested in, say, the effects of quality parenting on child development, you can't randomly assign babies to parents. Because ethics. Parents apparently want to raise their own spawn. But more than that, you might not want to be controlling the environment so much. If you're interested in how humans behave in the real world, you don't want your research methods to make them act differently than they otherwise would. Because the fact is, subjects might change how they behave if they know they're being observed. For a really fun and fascinating example of this, let's go to the thought bubble. In the late 1920s, Austrian sociologist Elton Mayo went to a telephone factory known as the Hawthorne Works in Cicero, Illinois. His goal was to help the Western Electric Company figure out how to make its workers more productive. So Mayo split the factory staff into groups. A control group who kept working under the same conditions as always, and an experimental group. For the experimental group, Mayo made a series of changes to their working environment. He gave them different work hours, changed up their rest breaks, even turned up the lights on the factory floor. And lo and behold, the changes seemed to work. The workers in the experimental group became more productive and absenteeism dropped. But the truth is, the changes to the physical environment weren't what made the difference. Yes, brightening the room made the workers more productive, but it turned out so did dimming the lights, and so did reversing all of the other changes that Mayo made. Eventually, Mayo realized that the workers were working harder because he was observing them. The fact that the workers knew someone was watching how hard they worked made them want to work harder. And this finding at the Hawthorne Works led future researchers to be much more aware of how their own presence influenced their findings. And to this day, the influence of an observer on the behavior of her participants is known as the Hawthorne effect. Thanks, Thought Bubble. So yes, studying humans and their behavior scientifically can be challenging. But yet another problem with positivist sociology is that not all social facts can be applied to all people in all time periods. In other words, truth is not always objective. It's like when you tell someone about your favorite book. If you're trying to convince them that Harry Potter is objectively the best book series ever written, then you don't know what the word objectively means at all. There is no objective truth about what the best book is. That's strictly subjective, an idea that's built on your own experiences and feelings. But as sociologists, we still find subjective experiences to be valid and important and even worth studying, even if we can't generalize them into some capital T truth about the world. Instead, we might be interested in how patterns in people's subjective experiences form the structures that make up our social world. In sociology, we talk about subjectivity as the meaning that people give to their own lived experiences. And this brings us to another way of doing sociology. Interpretive sociology is the study of society that focuses on the meanings that people attach to their social world, while positivist sociology is more interested in whether a person acts a certain way, something you can see as an outside observer. Interpretive sociology asks, why this behavior? What's the meaning behind it? And how do people view their own actions and thoughts? Interpretive sociologists approach their subjects with the aim of seeing the world from their subject's perspective, rather than through quantitative data. So there are fewer statistics involved in this type of research. Instead, interpretive sociologists often use interviews or face-to-face interactions with their subjects to understand the world. Now, there's one more school of thought about how the science of sociology can be conducted, and it actually relaxes some of the assumptions we made early on about the objectivity of the researcher. These thinkers believe there's plenty of room in sociology for subjectivity, especially for values. Values are the ideas a person has about what's good and the attitudes they hold about how the world works. And curiosity about a research topic often springs from these very values. Many researchers are drawn to the study of sociology out of a desire to understand moral or political questions about how societies work. Like, what's the relationship between race and poverty in the United States? How can understanding that relationship help break the connection between race and poverty? The argument for value-driven research rather than value-free research is one of the origins of critical sociology, or the study of society that focuses on the need for social change. These ideas go back a long time, starting as early as the 19th century when Jane Addams developed the Hull House, an organization that not only provided things like housing and education to low-income people in Chicago, but also researched the causes of and solutions to the ills of poverty. We'll explore all these schools of thought throughout the rest of the series. But for now, we talked about sociology as a science. We discussed positivist sociology and how sociologists use empirical evidence to explore questions about the social world. And we introduced two alternatives: interpretive sociology and critical sociology. Next time, we're going to learn how sociologists actually do their research. Crash Course Sociology is filmed in the Dr. Cheryl C. Kinney studio in Missoula, Montana, and it's made with the help of all of these nice people. Our animation team is ThoughtCat.
Okay, now let's proceed with our presentation. We're going to start with the science in sociology. Like all sciences, sociology asks questions about the world. It answers these questions with theories and hypotheses. Sociology tests its answers with empirical evidence. The word empirical means the evidence comes from observations about the real world. We call these observations data. We use empirical evidence instead of just logic or arguments as philosophers might use them. Sociologists instead use the scientific method to answer questions about the social world. In this process, our first step is to ask a question, and that requires curiosity. To be a scientist of any kind, you must be curious. And sociologists direct their curiosity and their questions to the social world. This example question to follow is going to be what guides the rest of our look at the scientific method and later research design in sociology. And that question is this: why are Danes happier than Americans? The second step is much more involved. Step one only requires that you be curious, recognize something about the world, in this case, that Danes routinely are found to be happier than Americans, and then ask that question as to why that is. The second step, answering the question, is where things get much more involved. Sociologists' answers to questions about the social world come in the form of theory. Of those, positive theory is the most common. As you can see, positive theory is distinguished from normative theory. Positive theory is objective and based on facts, whereas normative theory is subjective and builds on values. We're going to look now at another video, this one by Neil deGrasse Tyson, who's going to tell us about the difference between objective and subjective answers to our questions. Objective and subjective, as he will refer to them, truths.
A full explanation of a tweet that I once posted that I would later see on people's t-shirts. No, I wasn't paid for that. They just did it. That's fine. The quote is, "The good thing about science is that it's true whether or not you believe in it." And that, so to say that properly requires more sentences than that. That's the Twitter version of a kind of truth I want to share with you. And that's a scientific truth. A scientific truth is an objective truth. It's a truth that exists outside of yourself. Right? So an example of that would be, Earth has gravity, and we measure this. And we have machines that measure this, whether or not we are attending to the machines. And we know how this works, we can predict with it. You cannot cherry pick the laws of gravity. You cannot repeal the laws of gravity because last month you gained 10 pounds and you're angry with it. Right? The laws of physics and other discoveries of science come about not because we wish they were true, but because they're demonstrated to be true. We conduct experiments. I conduct an experiment, you conduct an experiment, she conducts an experiment. And by the way, not all experiments point to the same answers. Occasionally, we get 3 different answers. That means we are on the trail of nothing. Okay? That happens often in science, on the frontier of science. But here's how it unfolds. I perform an experiment. I say, I think this is kind of true, but I'm not sure. You perform an experiment. You're using different apparatus because you don't really trust my apparatus. You one of your own design. You make measurements. It kind of agrees with what I did. Then she makes a measurement with a different from another country with different voltage in the wall, and the experiment is of her design, and they get kind of the same result as well. And this trend continues. Eventually, you reach a point where doing the experiment is no longer interesting because you know what the answer is going to be in advance. At that point, we have an emergent scientific truth, an objective truth. These are the truths that affect everybody. That's different from a subjective truth. A subjective truth is something you know is true within yourself, but there's no real way to show that to anybody else. It's like within you. You can feel love for someone. You can have a spiritual experience, a religious experience. These are happening within you. And it's hard, if not impossible, to get someone else to have that same experience. It's within you. That's a subjective experience.
Okay, so what Neil deGrasse Tyson is telling us is that objective means something is true whether or not you believe in it. By contrast, something that is subjective means something that may be true only for you based on your beliefs or values. The goal of positive theory, right, this theory that's based on objective facts, once had the lofty goal of discovering iron laws of the social world. Right? Sociologists and other social scientists believed that we were going to come up with our equivalents of gravity for the social world. What we have found in time is that that pursuit is not going to bear fruit. And instead, what we see now is that sociologists are far more modest about their ability to find answers. We are much more modest about our ability, especially to find solid answers about the social world. As Nicole Sweeney said in the introductory overview video, social facts are not the same in all places, for all people, and in all times. And there are 2 reasons for this. One, the social world is complicated and it is very messy because it involves people, and people are naturally messy and their behavior can be unpredictable. The other part of this is that people, unlike what might be studied in the physical sciences, are not subatomic particles. They are not igneous rocks. They are creatures that have agency. You might call it free will. But part of the point of this is, one, they know when they're being studied. People behave differently if they know someone is observing them. That was what we saw in the Hawthorne effect in the introductory video. Another wrinkle is that theories that sociologists make about the social world can actually end up influencing human behavior in ways that affect the validity of that theory. Let's take this example, right? An example theory. The theory that good schools cause strong student performance. It seems pretty commonsensical, right? If it's a good school, it's going to be good for students. If the students are doing well, they're going to perform well. There are some real-world consequences of this theory. One is that middle-class parents And pardon the bell. All right, middle-class parents, and this is a story that is particularly focused on middle-class parents. Uh, Middle-class parents who obsess about their kids' academic performance have a tendency to move to school districts with strong student performance. So, middle-class parents obsessed about their kids doing well, want them to take them to schools that they think will help them do well, and so they go to strong school districts. This ends up having consequence for the theory. We are then left with a question. Do good schools cause strong student performance? Which is one question. Or do students perform well because they are encouraged and supported by their performance-obsessed parents? When the theory affects the behavior of those middle-class parents, we are left with uncertainty about whether our theory is still valid. Because, in other words, we've got this single question. What is performing well? The school, the good school, or the kids or their families? Which is it? Schools on the one hand, or kids and families on the other? Because of the way theory affects behavior, we no longer know for sure that our theory remains valid. That's part of what makes the social world messy and demonstrates that people are not inanimate objects like a subatomic particle or an igneous rock. They know when they're being observed, and what we learn about our behavior can influence future behavior. Okay, now in the previous slide, we discussed theory as the answers to our questions. And so here in this slide, we're going to look at some example answers or example theories to get at our root question. Why are Danes happier than Americans? Well, one potential answer, one theory, is that wealthy countries have happier people than poorer countries. Another theory is that ethnically homogeneous countries are happier than ethnically heterogeneous countries. And this second theory demonstrates the point. If that theory is correct, it might be correct in spite of the fact that we wish it weren't. Because what this theory is saying is that if you want more happiness in your country, make it less diverse. That's not an answer much of anybody wants to hear. Right? And yet, if that theory is correct, right, that theory is correct, right, whether we like it or not. And that is actually a theory about sources of life satisfaction for people, and one that we'll explore as we get into research design and kind of pursue this further. Right. For now, let's move on to our next question. Our next theory to answer our question. And that theory is this. Countries whose governments spend more money on things people see, making their lives better or happier. Right? Countries whose governments spend more money on things people see, making their lives better. Things like roads. Things like, maybe more thorough policing. Right? Or cleaner parks. Right? Those things, people see them, they make their lives better, and those people are happier because of their government's actions. Right? And finally, in our look at theories, people who trust each other and their government are happier than people who are less trusting. That may kind of seem like an odd one, but let's look at an example of trust in Denmark. And this also applies to some other Scandinavian countries. And in class, whenever I kind of propose this scenario, students are mortified that this happens. But in Denmark, it is not uncommon for a mother pushing a stroller with her baby to reach a store and on a nice day, sun's out, temperature's mild, leave the child on the sidewalk in the stroller and then go into the store to pick up whatever she needed to get. Completely trusting that her child is going to be fine and still there when she gets back from the store. Students in America think this is crazy. And when I ask them if they would leave their child outside of a Walmart, a Target, or some other store in our town, their answer is always, And pardon the bell. Their answer is always a resounding no. As a matter of fact, most students in my classrooms can't comprehend the possibility of leaving your child outside of a store. And of course, this is something that occasionally confronts Danish mothers or Scandinavian mothers that visit the United States. If they're in the habit of leaving their child outside, when they go into a store, this has happened, they've done this, and they end up confronting law enforcement for problems of child abandonment, child neglect. Right? So another way of thinking about this is imagine that you get to school, you've driven to school or you've driven somewhere else, and you get out of your car, you leave, you're inside the building, and you are not sure anymore whether you locked your car or not. And how do you feel about that? And most of the students in my classroom that drive, when I ask this question, they tell me they feel anxious, right? They feel scared, they're nervous, they're preoccupied with the possibility that they left their car unlocked. Right? So if we think about that, I mean, that stems from a lack of trust. We're not sure that everything is going to be all right with our car when we get back to it. Right? And we would be happier if we could trust that our car was going to be fine whether we had locked it or not. And so that gets at the sense that the more trust we have in each other, the happier we are. Right? And also maybe the more trust that we have that the government is going to do the right thing makes us happier. And so that's yet another theory that might explain why Danes are happier than Americans. For now, let's move on to our next step, and that is step number 3. Find the best answer. Right? Because this is science. We don't want lots of different answers. Right? That can be okay, but what we really want as social scientists is to find the best answer. It might not be an iron law, right? It's not the gravity of the social world, right? But it might be an answer that really does a good job of answering our question. Right? In other words, then, what we want is to find out which theory best explains why Danes are happier than Americans. Finding that best theory, right, that best answer, requires evidence. Remember, we want empirical evidence, we want observations from the real world, we want data. And there are 3 types of evidence that we're going to look at. And these are the 3 main types. First up is quantitative data. It's things we can count, statistics. The second is qualitative data. That can be things like detailed comparison. And finally, we'll look at what kind of goes by 2 different names. Some people refer to it simply as interpretive and others as interpretative or interpretative evidence. Right? This is evidence about what an act, what behavior means to the actor, right? What the behavior means to the person doing that behavior. Now, each of these requires its own explanation, and it's going to get it in the rest of this presentation. So first up, we're going to look at a particular type of quantitative evidence, and that is descriptive statistics. These just describe things. They're not explaining cause, effect, any relationship between stuff. It's just a description of some part of reality. So let's start with these descriptive stats. And in this case, we're going to take just a set of numbers. And we could call these observations. We could say that each of these numbers represents the amount of cash a person had in their wallet or their purse when we stopped and asked them how much cash they had. So this could be our set of observations. And one of the numbers of our observations that's going to be important is the median. And the median is just the middle number. So if we see in this string of numbers, there are 17, the highlighted 11 is the middle number. There are 8 numbers to the left of it, right, and 8 numbers to the right. And it is simply the middle number. The middle number can be important to have because, as we'll see, there are some problems with our next type of descriptive statistic, and that is the mean, right? Also known as the average. Now, the mean, in mathematical sense, it is the sum total of observations. So we add up all 17 of those numbers we've got in that list above, and then we divide that sum total by the number of observations we have. So that total divided by 17. And the number we get from that is 71.76. That's the average amount of cash, if that's what we want to call these numbers, the average amount of cash that somebody's got in their wallet. The problem with this number is that the mean is subject to skewing by extreme numbers. And we have an extreme number in our sample of observations. If we take out that giant 999, then what we're left with is a much, much smaller mean of 13.81. Right? So if we knock out that high roller, right, from our sample of people with cash in their wallets, then our mean changes radically. We can deal with this somewhat by knowing another number, and that's the standard deviation. Here we're not concerned about the mathematical formula for determining the standard deviation. At this point, it's enough for us to know that the standard deviation is a measure of how spread out our numbers are, how spread out our sample of observations, our data are. And we can see that with our example here. The standard deviation for our original set of 17 numbers, including everything from 5 all the way up to 999, is 239.23. Right? So if I were to tell you that somebody might have $11, give or take 239 bucks, right? You know that's a pretty big variation. Right? That's a lot of margin of error. And so our standard deviation is big. There is a lot of spread in our data. Right? And that's due to that very large 999 in our sample. Another type of quantitative evidence, and this is really the superior type for social science, is inferential statistics. Right? And this is, of course, another type of quantitative evidence. And what inferential means in inferential statistics is that we are trying to infer. Right? We are trying to draw or make general conclusions from our empirical data. So to infer is to draw conclusions. And that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to understand cause and effect. We're trying to understand relationships in the social world. A common type of inferential statistics is correlation. There are certainly other kinds, but what we will most typically deal with in this course is correlation. And correlation is how two or more things vary or change together. An example of this is income and happiness. We want to know the correlation, how these two things vary together. And what we can see here in this graph on the right-hand side of the screen is that the relationship between income and happiness, right, is that as income goes up, what we can see on what's called the x-axis here, right, happiness, the y-axis, goes up. So the more money, the happier. Now, there's a bigger jump here, right, between $20,000 and looks like about $100,000 in income. There's a pretty steady rise in life evaluation, how people feel about their life. Right? We see both of this and like the tendency for people to feel more positive as opposed to stress-free. That some of these things level off as income goes up. But there is a relationship, right? And that relationship in general is that more income to a point means more life satisfaction, more happiness. All right. Of course, not all evidence is qualitative, and not all questions we ask are best answered with theories supported by quantitative evidence. Sometimes we need qualitative evidence, and qualitative evidence is data that is not numerical. It's things to which we cannot assign a number. It can be descriptive, but the best is inferential. Right? And to help understand both inference and also the importance of qualitative data and how sometimes it's necessary instead of quantitative data, let's look at these three gentlemen in turtlenecks. Right? If my question is, why can these two guys pull off the turtleneck look, and this guy, let's be honest, pretty clearly cannot? Right? What's the difference? Why can these guys pull it off and this guy can't? We can't assign numbers to the success of Steve McQueen's turtleneck wearing or Daniel Craig's turtleneck wearing and this guy's turtleneck wearing. Right? There's no basis for that. I don't know how to quantify pulling off the turtleneck look. Right? But if we want to get into inferential statistics, we can try and draw conclusions. One of the ways we can do this is compare characteristics. Right? Maybe we can say that these guys managed to not look like total dorks in their turtlenecks because they don't have glasses, right? Or they don't kind of have like a mouth half open, clueless look on their face. Right? Instead, they look serious and confident like they know what they're doing. We can compare those characteristics, right? And maybe infer why it is that Daniel Craig is James Bond and Steve McQueen in an older action movie can pull off the turtleneck look and this poor guy cannot. We might also do case studies. Right? We might look at the histories of Denmark and the United States to understand historical events and the development of their societies and their cultures in ways that have made theirs happier than ours. Right? In the case of Denmark, we might look at the history of something they call hygge, which I'm probably mispronouncing because apparently we're told as Americans that we don't pronounce this Danish word correctly. And we don't even really have a sense for it. We don't have a true equivalent in the English language, but it's something akin to or similar to coziness. And we could find that out by case studies of the historical development of society and culture in the United States and Denmark. Can't quantify hygge. I mean, if we can barely even say it, the chance that we're going to be able to attach numbers to it is pretty slim, if we're honest. And then a final way of looking at this is through something called process tracing. And I'll move my image here up so we can see that. And process tracing, right, that explores, as you might guess, a process. And so one example of this, we might look at, in this country, causes of changes in attitudes towards same-sex marriage. We might look at people who once identified as opposed to it, but now at this point in time identify as either neutral on the issue or supportive of same-sex marriage, and kind of work through the process of what changed, right? What caused the change in their attitudes. That's not something easily done with numbers. Right? It lends itself to qualitative study and qualitative evidence, and that's fine. Right? It's one of the nice things about sociology is we've got different ways of answering different questions. From there, let's move on to our final type of evidence. This is interpretive or interpretative evidence, depending on how you choose to spell and pronounce it. Now, interpretive evidence is a type of qualitative evidence. But what makes it unique and what gets it its own slide in this story is that this is focused not on just what we can observe about somebody's behavior and maybe factors that we can see outside of them that would have led them to that behavior. Right? In this case, our focus is on understanding how that person or those people, right, because sociology is focused on groups, how a group of people perceives, right, how they view and feel about their own actions and motivations, how they see their own feelings. And the example of this you see on this slide is something called the Heaven's Gate cult. Now, before any of the students in my classroom had been born, this group of people had committed mass suicide near San Diego, California. And they did this, as we found out, based on a belief that a comet that was approaching the Earth at that point. Don't worry, it was not a case that the comet was going to hit us and like narrow miss and we're all right. This comet was always just passing by, but this particular cult believed that there was a spaceship trailing that comet and that it had kind of aliens that were in fact like a deity. They even believed that it might be the Judeo-Christian, Muslim, the Abrahamic religion's God was on this spaceship, and they were going to leave their bodies behind to be pulled up to the spaceship by committing suicide. And so they went through this ritual. They ate pudding or applesauce laced with barbiturates, which is kind of a tranquilizer. Then they consumed alcohol and suffocated themselves. Actually, they did this in shifts until everybody was gone. And to understand that, I mean, if we just look at that from the outside, even through a qualitative process, we can't understand their behavior unless we investigate how they perceived their own actions, motivations, and feelings. Right? We need to understand their system of meaning, their way of understanding the world, in order to really be able to explain why they did what they did. And sometimes to do that, right, of course, we just need to use interpretive evidence. We need to understand people on their own terms. Right. And that concludes this presentation. In the next presentation, we will look at research design for sociological studies. Again, if you need to, go back, rewatch parts of this presentation where you have gaps in your fillable guided notes, and I look forward to seeing you for our next presentation.